we're going to continue looking at key concepts of service management. And we look at this diagram here. Notice at the bottom, what's kind of supporting this entire relationship is value. So this section is going to focus on how an organization in the role of service provider should evaluate what its services should do and how its services should be provided to meet the needs of consumers. Achieving the desired outcomes requires resources and costs and is often associated with risk or risks. Service providers help their consumers to achieve outcomes, and in doing so, they take on some of the associated risks and costs. On the other hand, service relationships can introduce new risks and costs, and in some situations can negatively affect some of the intended outcomes while supporting others. Service relationships are perceived to be valuable only when they have more positive effects than negative effects. And we can see that here in the diagram. On the right-hand side, we have more supported outcomes. We've removed costs. We've removed risks. Therefore, the pendulum shifts in a positive direction. Acting as a service provider, an organization produces outputs that help its consumers achieve certain outcomes. So an output is a tangible or intangible deliverable of an activity. An outcome is a result for a stakeholder enabled by one or more outputs. For the ITIL-4 foundation exam, it's important to be clear about the difference between outputs and outcomes. For example, one output of a wedding photography service may be an album in which certain photos are artfully arranged. The outcome of the service, however, is the preservation of memories and the ability of the couple and their family and friends to easily recall those memories by looking at the album. Depending upon the relationship between the provider and the consumer, it can be difficult for the provider to fully understand the outcomes that the consumer wants to achieve. In some cases, they'll work together to define the desired outcomes. For example, BRMs, business relationship managers in internal IT or HR departments, may talk regularly with customers and discuss their needs and expectations. Finally, some service providers predict or even create demand for certain outcomes, forming a target group for their services. This may happen with innovative services, addressing needs that consumers weren't even aware of before. For example, social networks, or smart home solutions, or IoT, the Internet of Things. Let's understand costs. Costs refer to the amount of money spent on a specific activity or resource. From the perspective of the service consumer, there are two types of costs involved in service relationships. Costs removed from the consumer by the service, which is a part of the value proposition. This may include costs of staff, technology, and other resources, which the consumer doesn't need to provide. And then there's costs imposed on the consumer by the service, the costs of service consumption. The total cost of consuming a service would include the price charged by the service provider, if applicable, plus other costs such as staff training, costs of network utilization, procurement, etc. Some consumers describe this as what they have to invest in order to consume the service. Regardless, both types of costs are considered when the consumer assesses the value which they expect the service to create. To ensure that the correct decisions are made about the service relationship, it's important that both types of costs are fully understood. From the provider's perspective, a full and correct understanding of the cost of service provision is vital. Providers need to ensure that services are delivered within budget constraints and meet the financial expectations of the organization. A risk is a possible event that could cause harm or loss, or make it more difficult to achieve objectives. Risk can also be defined as uncertainty of outcome and can be used in the context of measuring the probability of positive outcomes as well as negative outcomes. Just like costs, there's two types of risk that are a concern to service consumers. There's risks removed from a consumer by the service, part of the value proposition. These may include failure of the consumer's server hardware or lack of staff availability. In some cases, a service may only reduce a consumer's risks, but the consumer may determine that this reduction is sufficient to support the value proposition. And then there's risks imposed on a consumer by the service. That's the risks of service consumption. An example here would be a service provider ceasing to trade or experiencing a security or a data breach. It's the duty of the provider to manage the detailed level of risk on behalf of the consumer. This should be handled based on a balance of what matters most to the consumer and to the provider. The consumer contributes to the reduction of risk 3 ways: by actively participating in the definition of the requirements of the service and clarification of its required outcomes, by clearly communicating the critical success factors and constraints that apply to the service, and ensuring the provider has access to the necessary resources of the consumer throughout the service relationship.